Yo, what is up guys? Delboy here, aka Blue Collar Sports TV. Hopefully you guys are doing well. If you're new here, smash that like, hit subscribe, all of that good stuff. First and foremost, I'd like to thank you guys for the support that you have shown the channel in the last week or so. We've actually done a few good numbers within the last week. I think we gained something like 150 new subscribers, which is pretty good going on this channel. So thank you guys very much. But as we all know, this past weekend we had the fight between Terence Crawford and Errol Spence Jr. Now, Terence Crawford in that fight dominated from start to finish, scored 3 knockdowns before eventually stopping Errol Spence Jr. in the 9th round of their fight. And immediately after that fight, after viewing such a performance, I was just, hyped up, super impressed, pumping full of adrenaline and whatnot. And, I think when you watch such a big fight in real time, I think you miss a lot. I think that's fair to say. And, that's why it's probably not the best idea to do post-fight reviews while you're still kind of in that mindset. But obviously the dust has now settled, and I'd like to talk about Errol Spence Jr., his standing, where he's at right now, and is there something seriously wrong with Errol Spence Jr. as a fighter, as an athlete going forwards? Does he have a future in the sport of boxing? And I know that may sound a little hyperbolic, one loss doesn't define a fighter, I get it, but I think this is an interesting and unique case when it comes to Errol Spence Jr. Going into this fight, I picked Terence Crawford by stoppage in between rounds 9 and 11. And quite frankly, my only real rationale behind that was just this gut feeling, intuition I had surrounding Errol Spence Jr.'s punch resistance. I felt it would be exposed in this fight. Not because it was bad initially, but due to what Errol Spence Jr. has gone through within the past few years. We're talking inactivity, blowing up in weight, the detached retina, and of course the car crash, which was serious, He was in ICU, things of that nature. He was through several feet from his speeding Ferrari. I mean, if that same thing happened to 100 people, I guarantee 95 would have died. He was very lucky to make it out of that with his life. And after that crash, after that accident, combined with everything else that's gone on with Errol Spence Jr., many of us asked the question, will this guy be the same fighter again? Again, going into this fight, I'll reiterate, I had a few doubts about Errol Spence Jr.'s punch resistance. However, what I saw in the ring, having watched it back a second time, his punch resistance is even worse than I initially kind of anticipated. And if any of you have been keeping up with boxing social media in the last day or so, you would be aware of a call that was made on the BDA boxing show, shout out to BDA, from a doctor, a supposed doctor, who was having his say on Errol Spence Jr., just sharing his thoughts on what he saw from Errol Spence. And he was under the impression that Errol Spence Jr. is still suffering residual effects from that car crash, potentially some kind of degenerative brain damage, so to speak. I highly recommend that you watch or you listen to that interview, because there are some very revealing details and some things that will definitely make you think. Now, is it histrionics? Is it just hysterical overreactions? I mean, it's possible, right? It's possible. Maybe Crawford is just that much better, but again, from what I saw from Errol Spence Jr., I saw a guy, having watched it a second time, with a clear head. I see a guy who was somewhat compromised. To me, what is very apparent is his punch resistance isn't what it was. I saw this guy in the UK take flush, straight right hands from Kell Brook, and Kell Brook in his prime could punch. I've seen this guy take a lot of shots from Sean Porter. Even when he got buzzed early in his career against Emmanuel Latte, he got buzzed for a couple of seconds, he immediately regained composure and went back to business. Look at the Ugas fight, look at what happened. He was discombobulated for a little while, looking for his mouthpiece, totally ignoring what was in front of him. Same goes for the Danny Garcia fight as well. He was taken out of a moment on both occasions, which was worrying. And I know he lost his mouthpiece, but that happens in boxing all the time, and it's very rare a fighter reacts in that fashion, let alone twice in a row, 2 successive fights in a row. And just how he took those shots against Danny Garcia and Yordenis Ugas didn't fill me with much confidence going into this Crawford fight in regards to Errol Spence's chances. To me, it is clear that the Errol Spence Jr. in which we saw had the worst punch resistance that we've seen from him. To me, that was very much clear, and I think the dead giveaway is how he was responding to the jabs of Terence Crawford. Yes, they were quick. Yes, they were powerful. But is a Terence Crawford jab more powerful than a Kell Brook straight right hand? Of course not. Of course not. To me, it's clear Spence's punch resistance isn't what it was. The main thing for me is ascertaining the reason why. That's the important question, in my opinion. Now, is it possible that the lack of punch resistance is just due to the fact that he's been cutting down to welterweight for far too long now? The weight cuts become too much? Of course that's possible. Maybe he was just completely drained. I mean, he did look a little dry going in there, in my opinion. He did. Maybe it is just that, but I'm not convinced, man. I'm not convinced. Another thing I've noticed post-car crash, and I'm glad I've actually seen some comments say this as well, post-Terence Crawford fight, and I've said this in numerous streams, because the topic of Errol Spence, what always comes up is that he's a massive welterweight, and he is a big welterweight. But I said in numerous streams, to me, post-comeback, I think Errol Spence Jr. looks smaller. Not that he's a small welterweight, but he looks smaller than he was. And I've never really been able to ascertain a reason for why that is. And in the Crawford fight, he looked as weak as I've ever seen him. Falling off balance, poor coordination, poor understanding of distance. And Crawford was able to kind of maul him, push him around. I mean, he really had his way with him, right? I know Crawford's a strong guy. I know he's got a wrestling background, but it almost looked like Errol Spence was hollow in there. Does that make sense? To me, he just looked piss weak. And, you know, Errol's always been a strong guy, especially pre-crash. And obviously, the most alarming thing for me is obviously the difference in speech from Errol Spence Jr. What I would suggest, go back and watch the pre-fight press conference for Errol Spence Jr. versus Kell Brook. Listen to how Errol Spence Jr. talks in those interviews in that press conference. Listen and understand how he puts his sentences together, how he puts his words together. Compare that to now. And again, I understand Errol Spence Jr. has like a fresh set of new teeth. I get it. And that can make a difference in regards to how you speak, you know? But not to that extent. He's slower. Errol Spence Jr. is slower. It's like he's always thinking. Well, it's like his thinking is slower as he's talking. It's like his brain is slow formulating what he wants to say before he says it, if that makes sense. And the speech for me is the big concern from Errol Spence Jr. Again, I'm going to hear it. Oh, he's got a thick Texas accent. We know that. We know he's got new teeth. But that doesn't change your speech patterns. How you put sentences together. I've known people with dentures. Yeah, there's a slight difference in how they talk, but after a while, they basically sound how they always sounded, with maybe a little difference. But it's very negligible, and more than likely after a while you can't tell the difference, but Errol Spence's speech is so much different to what it was, and to me that's the most concerning aspect. Aside from like the punch resistance, things of that nature, to me, listen, what is apparent for me, Errol Spence Jr. is way past his prime. Way past his prime. He will never be an elite fighter again. He's never going to achieve anything super significant in boxing again. I'm talking about obtaining big wins over genuine world-class opponents. That will never happen again. I really do believe Errol Spence Jr. is done at elite level. I know people are talking about going to 154. Again, based on what I saw, I wouldn't like to see him in there with someone like Tim Tszyu, a guy who can punch, who's bigger than Crawford, who's strong, who's fresh, who's young. You know, Tim Tszyu's been active in recent times. He's having training camp after training camp, keeping sharp. I wouldn't want to see Spence in there with someone like Tim Tszyu. I think that would be ugly. And again, I appreciate that, you know, it's wise to say these sort of things after the event. And listen, maybe the doctor who called in on BDA has got it wrong. Maybe this is just a case of histrionics, like I said. But my intuition told me something before this fight, that something wasn't quite right with Errol Spence Jr. And I never thought about it in depth like that. And it turned out to be the case. It turned out to be the case. Obviously, I've questioned the effect of the accidents, and I've said previously I was concerned in regards to how he responded to punches in the Ugas fight and in the Danny Garcia fight, but I never expected it to be as bad as it was in the Terence Crawford fight. And that's the worrying thing for me. If the doctor is right, then obviously this story is going to end very badly. And I know I've seen people say, well, if Spence was in that bad of a condition, why did he beat Danny Garcia? Why did he beat Yordenis Ugas? And that's a fair question. That is a fair question. But let's say the doctor is right and Spence does have some sort of brain issue post-accident. Well, then more than likely it is degenerative, right? It gets worse as time goes on. So maybe at that point in time, they could mask it a lot easier. They could hide it a lot easier. Whereas now, not so much, especially as the weight cut just keeps on getting harder and he keeps on getting older, you know, through another training camp as well. All that sparring, etc. And as we know, like, Ugas isn't a big puncher, and we saw how Spence reacted when he got hit flush in that fight. And there was a couple of other times where he stiffened the legs up of Errol Spence in that bout. So, listen, I would be concerned about Errol Spence. If I was like a big Errol Spence fan, I would be concerned in regards to his future. What I would say is, you know, things like CTE, traumatic brain injury, not only brain injury, but even just like dementia and cognitive illnesses, they are no joke. And if you've seen somebody with such an issue, then yeah, I see. I've got experience with you know, kind of seeing that, and that's why, again, it could be histrionics. I get it, but that's why that doctor's phone call kind of hit me hard in particular. It's because I've seen it, not from a CTE perspective, but I've seen, you know, degenerative brain diseases and just the effects in which they can take in a quick spell of time as well. So yeah, listen, boxing's a blood sport, as we know. I like to see good hard fights between two guys who are on a level playing field. I want to see a hard fight. I want to see knockdowns. I want to see knockouts. However, if I suspect a guy is compromised like that, I don't want to see him fight again. I don't want to see him fight again. Because I wouldn't want to see the guy get hurt because of that, you know. It's a touchy subject, it really is. But for me, when it comes to Errol Spence, there are so many things that when you add them together, to me it doesn't paint a good picture. Plus the fact after the accident, he still hasn't seemed to have stopped his drinking and consumption of alcohol, living that sort of life, you know, abusing substances, things of that nature. Again, you know, is that an issue with moderation and decision making? You know, being needlessly spontaneous. I don't think any of these are good signs, is what I'm trying to say. I hope that it's just, you know, just a bad weight cut and Spence was just drained and he's okay. That's what I hope. I hope all of this is wrong. I hope all of this is nonsense. I hope all of this is just us people going over the top. That's what I hope. But I suspect there is more to this than we have been led to believe. That's my opinion, based on what I saw. And quite frankly, I will say this regardless. If I were to click a button, and I could make the decision, I'd like to see Spence retire. I'd like to see Spence retire because I don't think it's getting any better than this. Listen, I can't see him getting back to that level. I can't. So yeah, I'd like to see him retire, personally. But anyway, share your thoughts below. It's been your guy Delboy. Peace.